There will be one continuing education credit hour offered for this, and we will give you instructions as we wrap up on what that will look like and what you need to do. In the meantime, I want you to know that we will use the chat and a couple of polls to check in with you throughout the session. That's to make this interactive. If any of you have ever been to the field in services that Julie and I have done in the past, we really rely on discussion and the synergy that comes when we work on this together. So we're going to use the best we know. We're going to use technology the best we know how to engage you. So along the way, please use, if you're not muted, if you would mute, that would be helpful. We have, 75 people have signed in, and we have more than 100 that registered. So if you mute, that helps us just manage background noise. The other thing I would ask you to do is add comments, right? Use chat to add to what I'm discussing, additional ideas. As Julie said, she's gonna, we'll stop and pause on those. She's gonna make sure that we don't miss anyone's questions. And then I really kind of designed this so that we would have a couple points where we break and we can invite you to contribute to the conversation. And we hope at the end to have some time for question and answer about how we're going to approach being field instructors in this really new and evolving climate that we're in. So with that, I'm going to start with a poll, and that poll is really to check in on your well-being. These are changing in uncertain times. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how are you coping with change and uncertainty? 1 would be barely, 5 would be mostly on top of it. And this is anonymous. We do not know what your answer is. So we won't be checking out who said what in this. So we have a few people left that haven't checked in, so I'm going to give it just a minute in case you're familiarizing yourself with polls. Okay, that's just about everyone. So I'm going to end this and share with you the results. So we had about 70 people. I'm sorry, I didn't look at the number and it's not showing that. Respond. 40% of you are right in the middle. We've got 20% that are mostly on top of it and a few that are really still struggling. And I will be honest that moment to moment, many of us go into that barely and struggling place. So I share this with you because I think it's a good place to start with a check-in. And what I would encourage you is as you check in with, or as you work with your students, that you're also checking in with them regularly. This is important and ever changing. And as field instructors, one of the things that we know when we're working with students is there's a parallel process. And how well they do in their field placement, it will be reflected by how well you are doing. And we know that their connection and their work with you is important on that. I wonder if anyone, so someone asked how you log into the poll. You should see the poll should have come up on your screen. So I'm sorry if someone missed that. You may have missed that if you called in. We also have someone shared their mantra, roll with it. Sometimes you need to tuck and roll and keep rolling. And isn't that true? As a field team, we've talked a lot about grace and flexibility. and more flexibility and more grace, because things continue to change as on a day-to-day basis. So we know you may have some questions about those. So you can put questions. Interesting, no poll came up. I'm not sure why it didn't come up for a few of you, because we had almost 70 responses. So we'll have to see if we can figure out what that was about. So the objectives for today. We're going to start with really exploring what we know that students need in their field placements. And we're going to talk about that in general, and we're going to talk about that, what do students need when they're doing a field placement during a pandemic. So you post your questions. Julie, if we need to stop and talk about policy or update them on things that are happening with field placements, we can do that. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to explore strategies that field instructors can use to engage students and monitor their professional development and learning. One of the things we know is that we have students this year that are going to be in completely virtual field placements. We have students that are going to be at their field placement in person 2 full days a week. And we have students that are doing some mix of both. So part of what we wanted to do is also check in with you. I'm going to launch this poll again.
How do I get the screen to come up?
I'm not sure what you mean screen.
I'm sorry, I was asking someone in my environment to get me on camera. Didn't realize my mic was open. I'll mute it and fix it.
Okay.
Sorry.
Find the start video button.
Okay. Thank you.
So Paris, can you help me move to the next poll? Oh, I got it. Never mind. Okay, Paris, I'm going to need your help in pulling up the next poll. The next poll is going to ask you to tell us where your students are. Here we go. So this poll is, what are your plans? Are you going to be virtual? Are you going to be in person? Are you going to have a mix of both? Or you're going to be not, or are you not sure?
Looks like we're stuck on that 85% there.
Yeah, that could be because there's a handful of us. What, would there be a problem in the setup? No, there's another one. I think there's a handful of us that are just, that are on the field team that are here or with the school. So we've had 67 responses. And are we sharing the results now? So of the 67, we have 30 students that are going to have a mix. That's the predominant. We have 13 that are going to be completely virtual, and we have 19 that are going to be in person, and 5 that are yet unsure. I think the one thing we know right now is that even if we're sure today, we know that that could change tomorrow, and we know that needs may evolve. So as we go through in this webinar, we're going to really spend some time thinking together about how we engage students in an unsure environment, in an environment that's ever changing, and in light of the fact that they may be either partially or fully virtual. So I'd like you to take a minute and find the chat screen and open the chat. And if you don't know where to find that, if you hover your mouse, it's either in a ribbon at the top or the bottom. There is a box that says chat. And what I'd like to ask each of you to do is I'd like you to just enter one thing in the chat that tells us what you know about being a field instructor during a pandemic. Nothing. Flexibility, it's doable. We'll come back and we'll review these together. So Julie, maybe once we get everybody's up there, I can get you to read some of those for us.
Mhm. Yeah, so we have a lot of nothings, a lot of change constantly, that we need flexibility, creativity, extra, it requires a lot of extra student support. Follow the guidelines, keep a structure, routine, and schedule. We'll make it work if it goes virtual. So, and then population specific with like older individuals and how to handle and what's the best way to move forward. You know, following recommendations, being supportive, more creativity, flexibility. It's non-transitional. It takes extra time. But I think that empowerment strengths approach, I think that covers it.
Okay, so flexibility, creativity, using a strength-based approach, being creative. So during this pandemic, we know that if we were on campus, we're obligated to be wearing masks whenever we're not in our offices or places that we live. That's for students, faculty, and staff. So I use this meme as an introduction to the idea. We know that during a pandemic and that for our own safety, PPE, having the personal protective equipment that we need for our own safety is important. I want to talk about the work of some colleagues on campus who have talked about the need for emotional protective equipment during a pandemic. These are colleagues that work in the medical school. Whoops. They work in the medical school. Dr. Finkelstein, Johnson, and Felton, they publish this. The link is on your PowerPoint. But what we know about what they've talked about is in these times, we need to be paying attention to well-being. We need to be paying attention to building resilience, that those are as important as the physical things we do to keep safety, to manage the stress of these changing times. So I share this with you because I think it's a relevant resource for our discussion, because it talks about both what we as professionals that are supporting the professional development of a student can do, as well as the things that we need to pay attention to as we plan for success for our students. So when it comes to, and what I'd like you to do, oops, I'm sorry about that. What I'd like you to do is think about these from a, let me challenge you to do one thing. I want you to think about your students' learning agreement as we talk about this. What are the things that you need to coach the student and direct them to put on their learning agreement? And as we talk about these things that focus on well-being and resiliency, do you have any ideas that come to mind that could be put onto a learning agreement? So our colleagues on campus that talked about our emotional, the emotional protective equipment we need, let's think about these skills and how we can foster our students. So the first is for individual skills. We need to be really mindfully practicing good stress management. We need self-compassion. How can you do that for yourself? How can you do that for students? We know all of the basics to keeping us physically safe and resilient include taking care of ourselves and our bodies, exercising, eating, sleeping, having a really solid routine. self-kindness and staying in the present, taking care about the quality and quantity of information you take in. And really early in the pandemic, I think many of us realized that we were looking for information and to know more, and then we were quickly on overload. So when we talk about these individual skills, what I want to suggest is that we want to think about how these can show up for students. I taught a course during the summer, and it started early May and went through mid-August. At mid-semester, I asked students, how are things going? What do you need? More than I've ever heard in the past, I heard them talk about needing assistance with things like time management. They needed assistance with things like scheduling. They needed assistance with their thinking about how they were going to get done what they'd committed to. So they were in class, but they were working from home. They may have, if some of our more traditional students may have gone back to their family's home. They didn't necessarily have protected space to study and work. So I think that things that in my course was a graduate course, and things that in the past I would have thought, these are graduate students, they have these skills, they can figure them out. During the pandemic, they needed support and they needed opportunity to slow down. They asked me for a bit more guidance about what was due when and where. And I kind of slowed myself down in making sure that as I approached working with them, they knew every week what was up, that kind of thing. Now, I'm not suggesting you have to micromanage your students' time. We want them to have that skill. But what I would do is suggest you think about how do you help them create the structure to keep up with that? Are there ways in your supervision that you can connect with them so that they have the structure to do the things they need to do to take good care of themselves? In particular, on this slide, we're talking about the skills that help them be resilient and that enhance their well-being. When we talk about the interpersonal and institutional skills, we're really talking about things many of us understand to be the things we do to be trauma-informed, right? We focus on physical safety. There are things now that we never thought we would have to talk explicitly with students about regarding their physical safety that we have to talk about. And I encourage you to think about asking them, how safe do you feel in this work if they're there in person? Even if they've had your training, even if you've given them all the explanation, chances to check in with you about that will be important. As important to physical safety as psychological safety. Although everything in the environment might be safe and they might be doing everything, if they aren't feeling safety and if they don't experience that safety, then that's an area to work on. So I think it's important. So this suggests that to really be prepared, we need to be focusing on both of those areas of safety. The next area of emotional protective equipment is focusing on connection and collaboration. I hope we can talk together this afternoon about how we build connection and how we collaborate and how we can do that specifically for our students. And with all of that, the other thing is when we look at culture, race, gender, history, voice, power, and equity, those are all things that, of course, as social workers have always been things we've looked at. But right now, we know issues of equity and racism and other kinds of privilege, power, oppression are really front and center for in our culture, in our world, in our communities, and being able to give students an opportunity to explore those issues. I had an experience this summer in the course that I was teaching where I was teaching a unit on the intersection of gender, race, and trauma. Of course, it was all online because we were working to be really accessible. So I asked the students to come together and talk that week. I said, let's talk about it. It was a week after George Floyd had been murdered and there was so much going on. So I pulled those students together and we had a conversation, and I'm like, what do you need? What are you noticing? What comes up for you? My takeaway from that is that our students are at such different places in development, and their ability to deal with issues of institutional racism, power and oppression. Some have are just becoming initially aware of it. Others are actively organizing in their communities and participating in social change activity. I had one student who was doing that, and another who said, I'm trying to figure out how to get my family to understand what's really going on. They don't get it. So my takeaway from that is that working with social work students in a time like this that are all at different developmental levels, I felt a bit like I was teaching K through 12 in a one-room schoolhouse. They're all there. They all have different needs. They're all at different places. And I really had to spend some time creating space for them to talk about it and figuring out where they were with these issues. So we're going to focus on well-being and resilience through fostering. We know we need to focus on individual skills and interpersonal skills. And the institutional skills are the things related to the environment in our agencies. Our university physician, who is leading the effort along with President Stanley to respond to the pandemic, published this in May of this year, and I held on to it. I think Julie and I had just talked about me doing this in service, and I thought that this might be a good way for us to talk about the other kinds of things that we need to be able to manage during a pandemic. So these are things that I share as my colleagues and as professional social workers. You all know these things, but they spoke to me because they're organized and written in one place. So these are strategies that the leaders in the university are suggesting. We validate each other's experience. We learn the difference between coping strategies that help and that don't. The reflective process in field instruction is so important, and students are learning and growing just like we are, and learning what works and doesn't work for them can really be a key takeaway of their field experience. We also need to recognize and validate grief and loss. The grief and loss related to the pandemic, related to issues with the racial equity issues that are happening, those are all really palpable, but there are also the personal grief, the personal losses that come with the changes in our structure. The students that aren't having the field experience they thought they would be. When they chose social work, they thought they would go and they would have this experience. They would be in an agency. They would sit with a field instructor face-to-face. They would meet with clients. They're having a different experience. The experience they're having will be the right experience, but we need to validate some of the loss and the difference between what they thought they would have and what they did have. Many of them may have different living experiences than they planned. If they were planning on living on campus, they're not living on campus now. They may have had to find other housing, or they may be staying home with family. They may be losing out on many of the college experiences that they thought they would have if they're a traditional experience or student. Our students that are non-traditional students, on the other hand, are facing so many other challenges. If they're parents, they may be a student themselves, they may be homeschooling kids, they may have kids in even more stressful circumstance. Maybe they have kids going to school every day and they're trying to figure out, how do I keep everyone safe? So there is just so much change and so much loss related to it that we want to validate that. We want to explore its impact on who we are as professionals and how we develop as social workers. With that, staying focused on the present. They may not be having the experience they thought they would be having, but they are having the experience they need to have. I've told students a couple times, you are learning how to be a social worker in a pandemic, and that is really important, and that's the most important thing now. And the challenges and barriers they face are things that, whatever the new normal is, will not be quite as challenging, we hope. And they're going to have some skills and some extra resilience. They need a chance to know that they're right where they need to be. Focusing on what they can control and what they can't. The routine and schedule, we're going to talk about some more specific things as field instructors that you might do, but if many students can develop their own, some are going to need your help. Self and other kindness is important. we need to understand that productivity and focus are impacted by the changes in the multiple demands that everyone is facing. Whether they're living in a home where and they have children and their children and everyone's at home and they're struggling because of that, or because of the kinds of losses they're experienced, or because they're afraid because they don't know what's going to happen next in their community, or how this field thing's going to work because it's not like they thought it would be. So we want to have lots of grace for recognizing when there's problems with focus and productivity. Not that we don't have expectations and foster learning. It's not to give excuse for doing nothing, but it is that we recognize that those are some challenges. And maybe it's in the reflective process, we identify and validate them and help students problem solve to move past them. The final point here is that social distancing is not social isolation. So I'll remind you what we all know, that adults learn through connection and relationship, and that the relationship that they have with you as a field instructor is really, really important for that.
Cheryl, there were a couple comments about social media and helping or not development of students, and another comment that social media adds anxiety and information and emotional overload.
It does. But so what do we do? How do we help students understand that? I know that I use a couple different forms of social media, and I know that I have to have awareness of that, and I need to know when I need to tune out. How do we help students with that? Because we aren't in a time where we can tell them don't do social media, right? So what can we do about that? I think it's really the awareness that they need. Anything else about social media or other? Let's move on, because maybe, one of the things you might do, I think that it's something that a couple years ago we might have thought, oh, there's a competency around technology and social work and students should do that. Well, in the last couple years, we've had standards around technology and social work that have been shared by our profession. So having students look at that and have them even look at the impact of social media on their clients, or how social media can be used effectively. Those could be some things you might put in a learning agreement that would help with that.
So there was a comment about apps being available to shut your phone on and off at different times of the day. That's interesting. Social media is like watching the news, good and bad with it. It's all about balance.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And social media in a time of social distancing where people feel it is social isolation, might feel the isolation from the distancing, or because they're not with the social groups they were. We know that they need connection and relationship. And I know that young people have used social media. The really young ones, gaming has been a real important point of connection for young people during the pandemic. It's a way for them to stay connected. So when we think specifically, the two previous slides are on what we need to do, kind of bigger picture things. Let's take this down to what our observations are about students and what students need. So they need connection and relationship. The primary relationship they have with you as their field instructor is important, and be sure that as you help them with the tasks, you're focusing on the reflective part of this. How are you doing? What do you need? What's coming up for you, so that they can integrate the personal experience with the professional learning. Also being very intentional about helping them with connections and relationships. So what we know is a student who is working completely virtual in an agency is not going to have the opportunity of walking by your door and seeing that you're available. They're not going to have the opportunity of going to, sitting in the lunchroom and meeting coworkers. They're not going to have the opportunity of the time before and after a staff meeting when you talk about things. In the school social work, we're not having potlucks, which are one of the ways that we connect with each other. So how do we build opportunities for connection and relationship when the informal things that we've used in the past aren't there. So I would suggest that as we work with them to develop learning agreements that you're looking at, and maybe it's not even in the learning agreement, it's as you help build structure for their placement. How do they build connection, and who are they going to have relationships with, and what can you do to foster that? For any comments, let's check in after each of these with comments so that we don't lose any discussion. Anything you want to add to that, Julie, or? Okay, so self-care. So what do we do to support students with self-care? What do they need? They're going to need more than they think they need. Folks, my experience with students over the summer, some in field, some not in field, is that, and part of how I know this is I had them in a class where they were learning about being trauma clinicians, and I was doing regular self-care reflective exercises with them. And of 12 students in that class, the majority of them told me at the end of the semester that they needed that reflective time more than they thought they did. They thought they were doing better than they were when they reflected back on it, because everyone is kind of in this survival mode. And if we're just working to get the next thing done and adapt to the most recent demand, then we have to stop and pause and think about self-care. So model that yourself for students. They need you to show how you're doing that and that how human you are as a professional, and then help them with that. Build that into their supervision, build that into the learning agreements, build it into the opportunities that they have to learn about the work in your agency. We need to think about structure. What structure will you give them? Even students who really thought they were, my experience this summer with students, they thought they were really organized and always did well, felt like they needed more structure than that. So I would suggest that, you know, if I were, for many years I was a field instructor, and often I would just go through and get an agreement with the students. Here are the tasks you have to do. Here are the meetings you have to be in. Here are the appointments you have, and let them manage things around that. I would do some check-ins with them to see, so how are you going to plan your day out, especially if they're not with you? It can be really easy to get sucked away from focus if they're not in a place, if they're not in the agency where they have that focused time, if they have many other distractions. So I think I would be really directive and ask them to work with me on that. Other resources that they might need. So one of the things is I've watched what field instructors across the country are saying. We've looked at resources developed by other schools of social work for their field instructors. With one of the grants I'm working on, we're looking at some of the challenges in having students have what they need for child welfare field placements. One of the things that has come up over and over again is the need to talk to students about technology. So are they using their own computer, or are they using something you've provided? What are the limitations if they use their own equipment? How do they get access to software that they need? If they're working remotely, how are they using their telephone? Are they using their own cell phone? Often we are. What happens with confidentiality with that? There are many, many really technical things about the resources that they'll need to use technology to get the work done. And I think it's really important that we explore with them what do they need, and that we be sure we give them good direction around technology, those kinds of things. Do they, it might be important also to ask them for all of the tasks they're doing, what resources they need. Things that they might find if they were present with you in an agency, they may not have access to if they're not in the agency all of the time. So thinking through issues around resource is important. Flexibility. So what I'm going to suggest that they need is to, you know, we talked about the grief and loss that comes with the change. There's also opportunity with that. I think it's important for students to know that while they develop a learning agreement with you, that you identify some of the learning activities they're going to have, so that they can be prepared for to meet the competency requirements of their learning agreement, that there may be new opportunities that they take advantage of that come up, and things may change. The other thing is whatever your circumstances are, think about contingencies in case the work that we do, we're more restrictive about being together and with clients, especially if you're not virtual. If you can spend some time brainstorming things that could be done virtually for a student that you're planning to be in person with, it may be very useful for you to be able to then, if something happens and your agency has to shut down for a couple weeks or there's some change, think together about how can you have a list of things or alternative activities that a student can do. And the idea is we want to think carefully about what do they need to learn about practice in the practice setting you're in. One of the things that didn't work the best with all of the circumstances in the spring was we had students that couldn't be in their agencies, and because of things happening in the agency, they didn't have access to their field instructor. And we were finding things for them to do. They were relevant learning things, but they weren't about practice in that agency. And we still want to have students have the experience so that when they finish their field placement, even if they're doing different things than we had originally anticipated, we know that they're ready to practice in your area. So if it's, you show them, here are some online trainings, or here are some additional resources you can look at if you have time and you can't do that. Thinking about other kinds of work that they might do for the agency that wouldn't be necessarily the first choice, but they are things that would be meaningful for them and for you. It takes a little bit of brainstorming and creativity, but having some contingency plans around anything that could be shut down is really important. I've already covered coping with loss and coping with uncertainty. These last two are really about those interpersonal skills that they develop and the personal stress management skills that they develop as they're working in their field placement. So let's, so with what we've talked about, I invite you to again to use the chat and share with us what are some ideas you have about how you're going to support your student. Things that, maybe things that I've said or things that spoke to you about what I said, or some ideas that have come up along the way.
There was a comment about being concerned about providing clinical experience with clients.
Mm-hmm.
Open communication, regular dialogue, good plan. Oh, they're coming in. Check in throughout the day. Communication structure, self-care. They'll be meeting in person.
Mm-hmm.
Have other interns connect to each other. Ongoing dialogue, structure, communication.
So as you think about students having clinical experience, I think that that's an area to also think about how you can give them opportunities to shadow or go alongside other people with what they're doing, okay? So that takes a lot of negotiation up front so that clients are know and are aware. One of the things that in some agencies that are using Zoom and other platforms have had greater opportunity for clinical interaction with clients. Students may not, maybe they're not, I'm making lots of assumptions about what your question or comment might be. They may not have the opportunity to do therapy if you're not doing that virtually, but is there other regular outreach and engagement that they can do to connect with clients, to build relationships? Can they help with doing some extra check-ins for more vulnerable clients. I think that's the place to get really, really creative. So when direct clinical interactions are not possible, we're looking to have survey, interact with our families via phone, students interact with families via phone and chat. Developing additional services for special needs students. You know what I think we should do, Julie, because there's a lot of good things coming up and it's hard to scroll through with so many. We can save the chat and maybe we can pull some of these ideas and just share them back with you all. Put them in a document.
Great idea.
Okay, so let's give some specific things about onboarding. And this really, many of these have already been alluded to, but we'll hopefully give you some things to think about as you plan. Some of you may have already done this, and I want to recognize those of you that did have students during the summer. We had fewer students in placement over the summer, but those that did, you all worked really hard to make that happen. We appreciate it. So onboarding, this is before they show up. Create a Dropbox or a folder on your server, someplace they can access where you have checklists, manuals, links to other kinds of like websites or documents that will help them understand the agency, any materials they might need, required paperwork. So gather those in advance and have them available electronically. Think about technology and have a plan. Do they use their own student email address? Do you give them an agency email address? What do they know about how they use that? If they don't have a phone offered by the agency, they can get a phone number through Google so that they aren't using their personal phone number or phone to contact with clients if they're working virtually. If you're not working virtually, but there could be a potential that there will be times where they will have to work virtually, still work out some of these options about how they can do this. What will happen with the computer? Do they need, usernames, sign-ins? Are there orientations they need to do? Can you begin to schedule those? I think thinking of a list of things, it feels often when I had a student, when I was a field instructor, they might follow me around for a day or two and I'd pull some things in around that. Now, if that can't happen and they can't sit with you through the day, can you pull those things together? If you can, please double check your, thank you. Somebody went off mute unexpectedly. On the first day, be really intentional. Set up appointments. They'll have some time with you to begin to establish a relationship, explore their role, tasks, goals, that kind of thing. Also, maybe plan for introduction to others, people that can be support to them or they might need to know. Just opportunities for them to get to know others. You might think about informally, have lunch together with the team. Where if it used to be you'd all be in a lunchroom, maybe you can all sign on and do a brown bag lunch if you're not together. So think about the things during the first day that will have the students know people on both a formal and informal level so they can begin to make relationships. I think the piece here is we have to be so much more intentional. It's kind of like we have to think about the things we would have done for a very shy student to create opportunities for them. We're going to have to do for even the most outgoing students so they know who to connect with. Also think about how, if students are going to be working more independently for all of their work, how are they going to keep track of what they're doing so that they can share that with you? Do you create a Google Doc that they record that in? Do they have a log? Do you have some checklists for them? The onus doesn't have to be on you to create all of those, but I would talk with the student about how you want to do that. In supervision, so this is, if you've been to one of the reflective supervision workshops that I've done in the past, this is about checking in with the students regularly about how they're doing personally, how the work's affecting them personally, what they're bringing to their work in the agency. So if you can focus on that. I like Kara added, what do you need? What are you noticing? What's coming up for you? Those questions regularly. You need mechanisms for formal check-in and protected time with you. You also need mechanisms for informal check-ins. Is it that you check in through sending a text, that they text you at the beginning and end of the day, or they check in with you at lunchtime? Can you use, do you have a platform where they'll know when you're online that they can come by and check in and let you know how it's going? So do that. If you're using Zoom or Teams or one of those forums, I would recommend you use the video. People are more attentive to relationship and connection if they see each other. And we know that, and please model that for them and do that with them so that if you're connecting virtually, you're doing that. I also think about some creative ways to do get to know you activities. What are some things you might do with a new group? Can you assemble some people and have student and do some formal introductions or things that help folks develop relationships? We just have to be more intentional with this. Can you simulate other in-office experiences? So that's, can you have coffee breaks? Can you have lunch breaks? Are there times before and after meetings that you can check in, that someone would check in with someone if you're all online for something like that? Think about if you're working even partially virtually, how do you create virtual experiences that simulate what happened to help students build relationships in the agency? While we're giving you lots of suggestions, I think it's important also to think about having students develop a way in some strategies about how they're going to get to know people and what they're going to do. You give them a list of people that they can learn, like who are they going to contact when, and have them set up the appointments by email, even that kind of thing. Anything that you're going to have to do to organize it, if you can do a little bit of organizing and let the student follow through, that's less on you, and it helps them in using their time and building the relationships. Okay, so we've talked about the other things here. So I'm gonna conclude with a slide from some training that we did at one point on virtual supervision. And this comes long before the pandemic, and this was about when people were working remotely. And this is across business sectors. Like, what do we know were the characteristics of supervisors that were successful when they were providing remote supervision, not with their supervisees daily? One is, the first and foremost, it's built on a foundation of trust. We don't start from the place where we think that people need to be micromanaged, and that if we don't have an exact accounting of every minute of every day, that then we can't trust that they would work. We start with a place of trust. We do want to check in and we do want to create accountability, but we start from the place of trust. In successful supervisors that are virtual are visible. That means that they are available and folks know where and how to find them. They're proactive. They aren't waiting for problems. They're anticipating. They're exploring what issues are going on so that they can respond to them. They are open and active listeners, and they're willing to provide feedback. They follow through on what they say. They adapt, and they directly address things that come up, which I think is the thing, that in the field office, what we ask most is if there are concerns or challenges, talk early and often to the liaison about that, and bring the field team in at whatever point you need, so that we're intervening and supporting you early rather than later. I could also say that even if we think we have a plan, it could go awry. I had a student over the summer that was placed in an agency, but working in another agency where the residents in that residential program all were, like more than half of them were diagnosed with COVID, and she had to work in the residential placement, limited her ability to be in her regular in-person placement. We sat down really early and brainstormed and came up with a number of things that let her to continue her learning while she was safe, and everyone at both agencies were doing what they needed to do to take care of business and keep clients safe. So we want to be able to proactively work on that with you all. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted to have an opportunity for any questions you might have, any additional dialogue, any comments that you have, Julie.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. Really appreciate your perspective and wisdom around all of this and suggestions. One of the things I think we need to talk to students about is their data. And if we're asking them to, so they're going to have some synchronous class time. They're going to have using their data from home. Could be additional costs and a hardship. So I would just encourage you to have a conversation with them about their data plan, the impact that that might have on them in terms of how much use they're going to really have to connect and do this experience well.
Questions? Julie, I wonder, do you want to talk to them about the university expectations around check-in and that kind of thing?
Around what?
The check-ins.
Oh, the health screen.
The health
So
screen.
just, yeah, so you know that whenever the student comes to your agency in person, they must complete a health screen form that the university provides. It's part of our tracing program. And so whenever they come on campus or whenever they go to an agency or anything educationally related that they are in person, they have to do a health screen form and let the agency know, or let us know if they have any symptoms or not. And then actually I'm at my office today because of internet connection at my house. I wanted to make sure I had adequate coverage and not have unstable connections. And I completed that health screen form, and I got a clear, like that. It was like an all cleared message that I received saying that I could come in because I'm asymptomatic. So that's they ought to the university's requiring that they follow the CDC guidelines in addition to whatever your guidelines are.
Is that form something that they have to keep a hard copy of?
No, but I did get a printout of it, and I mean I could have printed it out after. So it's an electronic fillable form, and then it will show the form completed. And I suppose if I wanted to print it, I could, but it will be stored within MSU's portal. So MSU will have a record of that.
I wanted to make a comment based upon one of the comments I saw in the chat that said that an agency was waiting to see what happened at MSU before they decided about how much contact students would have with clients. So I want you to know that all of our graduate classes are online. We are not meeting, there are no students in the graduate program that are meeting in person. The undergraduate social work classes are also all online. So if that's a part of your risk assessment, I would have a conversation with the student about what their exposure is, because there may be students that have no exposure at all because all of their classes are over Zoom. The faculty, before President Stanley shut things down, our faculty made the decision that relationally we would probably be better connected with students in small groups via Zoom than in really large auditoriums, 6 feet apart with masks on behind plexiglass. So we made some of those decisions early. So it doesn't mean if a student had a course outside of social work that they wouldn't have had contact, but right now none of them should, unless they're living in student housing. They wouldn't have, or working on campus, they wouldn't necessarily have a lot of exposure to what's happening on campus. There's a question, can we go through that process for those forms? I don't quite understand what is required of the agency for these forms. Our agency has protocols in place.
Okay, so the form is through MSU, and the student, there's nothing the agency needs to do around this form. The student simply needs to access that website, and I can pull it up and send it to you if you want it. But you just the student just has to complete the form online before they go to the agency. So it's the MSU's deal. Nothing you need to concern yourself with.
If the practicum is not on campus, do they still fill the form out if they are going on site but not on campus? Yes.
Yep. Anytime they are going someplace in person related to their field placement, they need to complete that form.
So a student placed in a community mental health agency in Marquette is completing that form for MSU before they go.
That's correct.
They will do the form daily for each day of placement, correct? We also want them to do whatever your agency requires too, because that will be important for your contact tracing if that comes up. What is the policy if they're scheduled to be into work, however it's a holiday?
They don't have to go if it's a holiday and the agency's closed. It could be one of those days that they do something virtual or remote work. They don't get credit for that field time because the agency's closed. So they still need to make up the hours. Correct. Only if the student is physically in person someplace will they need to complete that form. If they're sitting at home or someplace else, they don't need to complete that form.
Cheryl and Julie, would you be okay with, I just noticed that a few people have left the meeting, and I wanted to be able to make that announcement about the CE credits before I miss too many people.
Sure.
I just wanted to let everyone know, if you are interested in gaining the CE credits for today's training, you should expect to receive an email from us at swkce@msu.edu. You should expect to receive the email from us within 24 hours or probably just later on this afternoon. And you must complete that post-training evaluation within 7 days of receiving the link. So fast forward, that'll be September 4th. The survey will be closed on September 4th at 9 a.m. And a certificate will be automatically generated at the end of your survey. And you're going to be required to download, save, or print that certificate before navigating away from that page or closing down your browser, because you won't be able to get that certificate to auto-generate again. And that certificate serves as your proof of your CECHs today, and you shouldn't expect to receive one in the mail. To receive the continuing education content hour credits today, you should have stayed for the entire program. And if you have any questions about the CE credit as it relates to this training today, please email us at swkce@msu.edu, or our direct phone number is 517-353-3060. That's it from me, Cheryl and Julie. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. We appreciate your help in providing the CEs.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there was a request to I think have similar kind of meetings like this, just to check in throughout, maybe on a monthly basis, and we certainly can look to do that with maybe field instructors and liaisons, and just offer a time to check in and see what it is that we need to do. So thank you, Kelly, for that suggestion, and we'll the field team will schedule that. We'll look for one maybe the last week of September.
Really good to see so many of you virtually today. I love seeing all the names of former colleagues and students.